November 24th, 1944, Tokyo Bay. A pale winter haze hangs over the water as anti-aircraft crews scan the sky, their breath drifting in thin clouds across the gun emplacements. For years, they had been told the same certainty. Japan's distance, weather, and sheer geography make large-scale American bombing impossible. Even if U.S. forces tried, the aircraft would never reach the home islands in meaningful numbers. But just after midday, faint vibrations ripple across the air, too steady to be thunder, too distant to identify. Spotters raise their binoculars. High above, nearly invisible against the cold blue, thin white contrails begin to form, dozens of them. Then more. An entire arc of sky slowly fills with the signatures of aircraft flying far higher than expected, far earlier than believed possible. Japan's long-held assumptions are about to be tested. And to understand why, we must first revisit the world that allowed those beliefs to take root. For decades before the B-29 appeared over Japan, military planners in Tokyo built their defensive worldview around geography. The home islands sat deep in the Pacific, hundreds of miles from any foreign base capable of supporting large four-engine bombers. Even at the height of American industrial expansion, no aircraft in service seemed capable of crossing the vast ocean, climbing above 30,000 feet, carrying a useful bomb load, and then returning safely. Distance itself was considered a fortress. Japanese officers in the 1930s studied the performance of American B-17s and B-24s and concluded that such aircraft, while formidable, lacked the range to reach Tokyo from any plausible Allied foothold. Even if the United States somehow seized a chain of islands, engineers argued, the logistics of building massive runways, supplying fuel, and maintaining long-range bombers across thousands of miles of open water would be prohibitive. The Imperial Army and Navy accepted this analysis as settled truth. By 1944, those beliefs hardened further. The early U.S. attempts to bomb Japan from China, launched from hastily constructed airfields in Chengdu, appeared to validate Japanese confidence. Sorties were sporadic, payloads light, mechanical failures common. Japanese troops who witnessed these operations described them as token raids, costly demonstrations rather than a sustained threat. Commanders in Tokyo concluded that long-range strategic bombing simply could not be sustained against Japan's interior. This mindset shaped everything: deployment of fighter units, placement of radar sites, allocation of fuel, even the morale of the rank and file. Soldiers on the home islands believed major American attacks would occur at sea, not from the sky. Civilians were taught that small, scattered raids might occur, but that large cities, Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, were far beyond the reach of foreign bombers. Yet, as Japan focused its energy on battles across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Rim, a different kind of war was being prepared thousands of miles away. In American factories, engineers were refining a machine unlike anything the world had flown before, a pressurized, high-altitude, long-range bomber built specifically to cross oceans and survive hostile airspace. But before it could threaten Japan, the United States needed a vantage point close enough to launch it, and that vantage point would emerge from the Marianas, captured in mid-1944 at a staggering cost. And it was from those islands that assumptions carefully cultivated over years would begin to unravel. In the weeks after the Tokyo firebombing, the rhythm of the raids changed. Night after night, the B-29s returned, sometimes in smaller groups, sometimes in large formations, each mission adding to the pressures already straining Japan's defenses. Cities that had once appeared distant from the front now faced a steady pattern of alarms, the sound of engines arriving from the direction of the Pacific, and the glow of fires reflected against cloud layers. The repetition carried its own weight. Even before a new attack began, many understood what its course would resemble. Across Japan, urban centers adjusted as best they could. Fire breaks widened, reservoirs filled, evacuation routes marked with clearer signs. Schools organized students into work teams. Factories shifted production hours to avoid the heaviest periods of smoke drift, and families divided belongings into bundles kept near the door in case they had to leave quickly. These measures offered structure, but they could not restore the sense of distance people once believed protected them. The bomber routes had shown that the space between Japan and the Marianas was no longer an obstacle. It was a corridor. Military planners faced a narrowing range of choices. Interceptor units needed fuel. Fuel was scarce. Radar coverage required upgrades. The equipment was limited. Anti-aircraft ammunition had to be distributed in higher volumes to major cities. The supply network was strained by losses in shipping. Each request outpaced the ability to fulfill it. The decision-making did not collapse suddenly. It tightened month by month as the resources required to change the situation no longer matched what was available. Industrial centers shifted production toward emergency needs. Machinery was moved inland, dispersed across smaller workshops, or relocated to rural areas where facilities could be concealed among hills or forests. This decentralization offered partial protection, but carried its own challenges: transportation delays, reduced efficiency, and the difficulty of coordinating distant sites with limited communication. Output continued, but in forms shaped increasingly by necessity rather than strategy. In government offices, the reports compiled after each raid formed a record not only of damage, but of transformation. They showed factories adapting to constant disruption, cities reorganizing after repeated fires, and civilian populations moving in large numbers towards safer regions. Much of the country remained determined, but the nature of endurance had changed. It was no longer defined by confidence in physical protection, but by the effort required to function within conditions that shifted unpredictably. Among civilians, the understanding grew quietly. People read the charred outlines of neighborhoods, the crowded stations filled with evacuees, the rows of temporary shelters built near surviving districts. They learned the sound of distant engines against winter air and recognized how long it took for the noise to fade. These were not dramatic revelations. They were parts of daily life, small reminders of a threat that no longer appeared occasionally, but returned with regularity. By spring, the pattern had become unmistakable. The raids shaped the movement of people, the operation of factories, and the expectations of the coming months. The distance that once seemed insurmountable now felt close, not because it had changed, but because something else had crossed it with ease. The arrival of the Superfortress over Japan marked more than the introduction of a new aircraft. It revealed how quickly the boundaries of war could shift once assumptions no longer held. For years, Japan had measured its security through distance and geography, believing the Pacific itself would blunt any attempt to strike its cities on a large scale. The B-29 crossed that space in a single arc of flight, turning what once seemed protective into something that offered no barrier at all. The experience changed both sides. For Japan, it exposed the limits of a system strained by years of conflict, an air defense network built for threats of a different scale, an industrial base vulnerable to disruption, a population unaccustomed to the constant presence of strategic bombing. For the United States, the campaign demonstrated the reach of modern air power and the consequences that followed when technology, logistics, and doctrine aligned with enough force to reshape a distant battlefield. Yet beyond military strategy, the raids left an imprint on the people who lived through them: civilians navigating darkened streets, crews fighting fires that spread faster than water could contain, families watching familiar neighborhoods vanish overnight. These experiences formed a record of the war that numbers alone cannot express. By the final months of 1945, the firebombing campaign, the collapse of Japan's defenses, and the rapid advance of Allied forces in the Pacific had drawn the conflict toward its end. The skies that once appeared unreachable now served as reminders of how quickly the conditions of war could transform. In that change lies a central lesson. When technology redefines the limits of distance, the assumptions built upon those limits must shift as well. The B-29 made that truth visible across the home islands, one flight at a time. Through the winter of 1944-45, the raids continued at high altitude, but their results fell short of American expectations. Winds over Japan scattered bomb patterns, cold temperatures strained engines, and visibility often shifted without warning. From Tokyo's perspective, this seemed like affirmation. The intruder could reach the home islands, but its power appeared limited by the very conditions Japan believed would guard it. Factories repaired damage, rail lines were cleared, and life resumed quickly after each attack. But within the Marianas, frustration turned to reassessment. Commanders studied the patterns of wind, the performance of incendiaries, the limitations of bombing from extreme height. One conclusion emerged repeatedly: accuracy demanded a different approach. Among those analyzing the results was General Curtis LeMay, recently placed in command. His view diverged from earlier strategies. If high-altitude attacks were losing precision to weather, then altitude itself had to change. The Superfortress, built for upper air, would have to do something unexpected: fly low. In early March 1945, preparations began for a nighttime operation unlike any previous raid. Armor would be removed to lighten the aircraft. Machine guns, except for those in the tail, were taken out to reduce weight further. The bombers would descend thousands of feet, flying in darkness over the sea, entering Japan at altitudes low enough to avoid the harsh winds that had dispersed earlier strikes. They would rely on speed, surprise, and the reflective glow of urban areas to guide their approach. The crews understood the risks. At lower altitudes, they would be within reach of anti-aircraft fire and vulnerable to any interceptors still able to climb. Yet many accepted the change with a sense of clarity. The earlier raids had shown the limits of the old method. Something different was required if the campaign was to achieve its goals. On the night of March 9-10, 1945, nearly every available B-29 lifted from the Marianas, engines rolling across the runways in long, continuous waves. Once airborne, the aircraft leveled out not into the thin air above the weather, but into the heavier, darker atmosphere closer to the ocean's surface. Their navigation lights were off, their formations looser, their routes chosen to converge over the heart of Tokyo. Japan's capital lay under a cold, steady wind. Most people had already settled into sleep when the distant sound of engines reached the coastline. Radar operators noted the unusual altitude. Anti-aircraft crews prepared quickly, uncertain how to respond to a pattern so unlike the familiar high-altitude tracks. The first groups of bombers crossed the outskirts of the city minutes later, opening their bomb bays over densely built wooden neighborhoods. From above, the incendiaries released in a steady flow, tracing downward arcs that multiplied as more waves arrived. The fires they sparked spread rapidly through districts shaped by narrow streets and close-packed homes. Wind carried embers from block to block, forming lines of flame that joined into wider fronts. The glow grew visible even from aircraft still approaching the city, guiding crews toward the areas marked on their maps. For those on the ground, the transformation was immediate. Fire breaks that had served as barriers in earlier raids struggled against the scale of the attack. Crews directing pumps and sand lines found themselves working against heat that intensified faster than they could respond. Whole sections of the city brightened, then blurred into a single field of orange light. The bombers continued their passes, guided now not by instruments, but by the expanding outlines of the burning districts. Each turn revealed new columns rising into the sky, their light reflecting off the surfaces of the aircraft. For many crews, The scale of the firestorm became clear only as they circled to regroup for the long journey home. By the time the last aircraft left the city behind, the glow of the fires was still visible across the horizon. In Japan, reports moved through military channels through the night and into the morning, carrying descriptions of conditions no longer defined by altitude or distance. The war had reached the capital in a form few had imagined possible. Morning light revealed the scale of destruction across Tokyo. Smoke drifted over the city in long, uneven bands, settling into streets where entire neighborhoods had vanished. Fire crews moved through the remains with little sense of direction. Landmarks they once used to orient themselves were gone. Rail lines twisted from heat, water mains ruptured, and blocks that had been densely populated were reduced to ash. For many, the night had passed in fragments, the sudden alarms, the search for shelter, the wind carrying sparks from one district to another, and the daylight offered no clear beginning or end to what had occurred. Military observers documented the damage with the same precision they applied to earlier raids, but their notes reflected a shift. Previous attacks had been measured in terms of industrial capacity lost. This one reshaped entire wards. Reports from the Home Ministry described the movement of hundreds of thousands of civilians, families seeking relatives or walking towards shelters still intact. The city's emergency systems strained under the load, not from a series of scattered strikes, but from a single continuous event that had overwhelmed the methods designed to control urban fires. For Japan's Air Defense Command, the questions grew sharper. They reviewed the tracks of the attacking aircraft, noting the low altitudes, the timing, the concentration of incendiaries. The changes in American tactics were clear, and with them came a realization. The adjustments Japan had expected to make gradually were now required immediately, within limitations that could not be easily overcome. Fuel shortages restricted training. Replacement aircraft arrived in numbers too small to alter the balance, and the pilots available to fly them faced missions increasingly defined by altitude gaps and limited endurance. Across the country, industrial output felt the impact. Workers displaced from burned districts moved to temporary shelters near surviving factories or rail hubs. Production slowed as transportation routes shifted, equipment was relocated, and supply chains adjusted to conditions not yet stable. Even facilities untouched by flames experienced delays as the movement of materials became dependent on altered lines and detours. Yet the most significant change was not measured in tonnage or schedules. It emerged in the quiet conversations that followed, in the recognition that an attack of such scale could reach the capital and return safely to its distant base. This understanding spread gradually, carried in briefings, in meetings among city officials, in the routines of those repairing utility lines or sorting records in damaged offices. The belief that distance and altitude offered inherent protection no longer aligned with what people witnessed. And as the next weeks unfolded, the effects of that shift began to appear across Japan, in its defenses, in its industries, and in the lives of those who had once considered the sky too far to pose a lasting threat. None of these perspectives, civilian, technical, or military, stood apart from the others. They formed layers of experience, each revealing something about the new shape the war was taking. And while most of Japan continued its routines, the signs were already visible to those watching closely. The sky was being measured in new ways, and the boundaries that had once seemed certain were beginning to slip quietly out of place. The first major raids from the Marianas began before most people in Japan understood how close the war had drawn. At dawn, the B-29 crews walked across dimly lit runways on Saipan and Tinian, the engines of their aircraft sending long, steady vibrations across the ground. Their missions were planned with precision: climb gradually over the open Pacific, settle into formation at altitudes where the air thinned into a pale, translucent blue, and cross the final stretch toward the home islands without descending into the zones Japan had trained its defenses to command. When the formations reached the coastline, the sky over Japan looked unchanged, clear in some regions, scattered with winter haze in others. Radar operators watched faint traces appear on their screens, small points rising higher than expected, behaving differently from the bombers they had tracked in earlier years. Calls went out to fighter bases and crews moved quickly, but many aircraft needed long minutes to gain the height required for interception. Every meter climbed drained fuel, and by the time some fighters neared the intruders, the bombers were already extending ahead. On the ground, anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, the bursts blooming in disciplined patterns. Gunners worked through their drills with practiced speed, adjusting elevation and fuse settings in response to each new report. But the shells carried only so far, and the B-29s remained above the arcs where accuracy held meaning. Crews watched the trails of explosions below them, the patterns forming brief shapes before dissolving into the air currents. At those heights, the sound of the bursts barely reached the aircraft. From the bombers, the cities below appeared in muted detail, rivers cutting through districts, rail lines branching outward, docks stretching toward the water. Crews focused on instruments, drift readings, and bomb release points, aware that every second counted against fuel reserves needed for the long return flight. The first waves dropped their payloads on industrial sites, aircraft plants, and engine works. From above, the impact was visible only in fragments, flashes of reflected light, faint columns rising through the haze, roads briefly illuminated by fire. In Japan, the response was uneven. Some reports described the raids as limited, the damage contained, the threat manageable. Others noted the altitude, the size of the formations, and the regularity with which the bombers appeared. The contrast reflected not uncertainty in the events, but the difficulty of interpreting something that exceeded the framework through which Japan had long viewed its defenses. For years, doctrine held that long-range, high-altitude attacks in large numbers were beyond the enemy's capability. Now the evidence contradicted that belief, but the scale of the change was not yet fully grasped. Fighter units continued to launch in determined attempts to close the distance. Pilots pushed their machines upward, oxygen masks tight against their faces, watching the sun reflect off bomber fuselages just beyond effective gun range. They could approach enough to feel the turbulence trailing behind the formations, but not enough to break through their defensive fire. Many returned with engines overheating, fuel gauges low, and no clear sense of how to force an engagement. What stood out most during these early missions was not the destruction, significant though it was, but the consistency. The bombers came again and again, each time flying with more confidence, each time revealing small adjustments in formation and route. The rhythm of the raids carried a message more troubling than the damage they inflicted. The Americans were not testing possibilities. They were establishing a presence over Japan's skies. And as these flights continued, one realization began to surface among those who watched the altitudes and plotted the tracks. This was no longer a question of whether the enemy could reach Japan. It was a question of how far they intended to push the advantage, now plainly within their grasp. In Japan's great industrial centers, Osaka, Nagoya, Tokyo, daily life still moved with the rhythm of work whistles and factory sirens. Air raid shelters stood ready, but they were used mostly for practice. People had grown used to the idea that long-distance threats would arrive rarely and in small numbers, just as they had throughout the early years of the war. The belief was not born of complacency, but of geography. The Pacific seemed too wide, and the war's demands too heavy for the enemy to reach them in force. Families walked evening streets without imagining that aircraft, far beyond their sightlines, were already learning the paths that would soon lead overhead. Inside technical bureaus and research offices, engineers studied reports with a different kind of focus. Their work depended on calculations, altitude limits, rate of climb charts, oxygen tolerance curves. When American aircraft were first sighted at unexpected heights, the figures did not align with earlier assumptions. Engines climbing that steadily should have strained. Bomb loads at that range should have reduced performance. Yet the numbers continued to shift as new sightings came in. The engineers did not speak in dramatic terms. They dealt in increments. Meters gained, knots recorded, oxygen usage noted. Quiet adjustments appeared on charts, small corrections that hinted at machines operating in ways Japanese defenses had not anticipated. Nothing was certain yet, but the data carried a tone of unease. Among senior officers, the changes were felt not through mathematics, but through a tightening of options. Requests for more fuel, more pilots, more interceptors arrived faster than the supply system could answer. Units protecting the southern coast asked for reinforcements. Northern commands requested upgrades to their radar sets. Maps once covered in neat defensive arcs now showed gaps that widened with every report of aircraft passing higher than interception lines. Discussions inside meeting rooms grew more constrained. Some argued that the American raids were still limited in scale and impact. Others pointed to evidence that the bombers were returning again and again, each mission smoother than the last. No single view dominated, but the atmosphere carried a weight that had not been present months earlier. Across the ocean, the airfields of Saipan and Tinian offered a contrasting scene. Engines warming at dawn, long rows of aircraft illuminated by floodlights, maintenance crews moving with practiced coordination. Every mission added to the understanding of the Superfortress, how it reacted to crosswinds, which altitudes offered the best balance between fuel and stability, how formation spacing affected bomb patterns. Small adjustments accumulated across the bomber force, shaping tactics not through theory, but through repetition. The capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam in mid-1944 altered the Pacific War more profoundly than most Japanese officers realized at the time. Maps in Tokyo showed the Marianas as distant dots, but for American planners, they were stepping stones, flat expanses of coral close enough to Japan to support a new kind of bombing campaign. What mattered now was not the islands themselves, but what could be built upon them. Almost as soon as the shooting stopped, U.S. Navy construction battalions flooded the terrain with bulldozers, graders, and steel matting. Hills were carved away, jungle burned, coral leveled. Runways stretched farther than anything previously laid in the Pacific. By autumn, Tinian alone housed airfields capable of launching entire wings of heavy bombers, each one serviced by fuel lines, repair depots, and a logistical network extending back to California and beyond. Japan had never faced an opponent able to build striking power at this scale, so close and so quickly. Yet Tokyo's assessments remained anchored to earlier experience. The B-29s operating from China had struggled with weather, engineering faults, and nearly impossible supply lines. Japanese analysts concluded that even with new bases, the Americans would face the same limitations. Reports circulated that the Superfortress consumed too much fuel, overheated unpredictably, and was too complex to maintain in forward areas. Many officers believed the aircraft could appear over Japan only in small groups, and even then only sporadically. What those assessments missed was the accelerating pace of modification. By late 1944, engine upgrades reduced fire risk, precision instruments improved reliability, and the sheer depth of American supply ensured that spare parts and replacement aircraft flowed constantly into the Marianas. Every shortcoming observed in China was being corrected, tested, and integrated into a bomber force that grew larger by the week. Inside Japan, the public remained largely unaware of these developments. Newspapers insisted that the home island stood beyond the practical reach of foreign bombers. Civilians were told that their cities lay protected by distance and the endurance of the imperial forces. Even among soldiers stationed near major urban centers, the idea of a sustained American air assault felt remote, an eventuality for which they trained but not one they truly expected. But along the coastlines, in radar shacks and observation towers, caution was beginning to surface. Crews reported faint contacts at altitudes higher than most interceptors could reach. Intelligence officers noted unusual radio traffic from the south. Day by day, the evidence grew clearer. The Americans were preparing something unprecedented. And as preparations on the Marianas intensified, those early observations would soon converge into a realization that Japan's defensive assumptions were far more fragile than anyone had admitted. The first groups to confront the arrival of the B-29 were the men stationed closest to the sky itself, the anti-aircraft crews scattered across Japan's coastal batteries. Their routines had changed little since the early years of the war. Spotting drills, ammunition checks, elevation calculations traced on worn chalkboards. Most had never faced an enemy bomber flying far above the reach of their guns. When the new contrails first appeared, they raised their field glasses expecting familiar silhouettes. Instead, they saw distant flecks glinting in the sun, steady and unhurried, moving at altitudes where the air itself seemed too thin to support flight. The crews fired because that was their duty, but each salvo ended in the same way, bursts blooming far below the intruders, drifting slowly apart before dissolving into the upper haze. What had once been a shield now felt more like a gesture, a necessary one, but increasingly symbolic. The fighter units stationed across Honshu and Kyushu faced a different challenge. They lived by engines, oxygen gauges, and the steep climb into combat. Japan had once trained some of the most skilled aviators in the world, but by 1944, the strain of prolonged war weighed heavily. Many veterans were gone, and those who replaced them flew with limited hours in the cockpit, rationed fuel, and machines pushed beyond their limits. Intercept orders against the B-29 meant climbing until the horizon curved and the engine note thinned into a strained metallic vibration. Pilots described the effort as flying up a narrowing tunnel of air, the aircraft trembling as it neared ceilings not meant to be reached. Even when they sighted the bombers, the gap remained stubborn, an unreachable line just ahead, just higher, just out of range. Guns that had once torn into enemy formations now spat rounds into empty sky. Far away on the Marianas, American crews lived a contrasting rhythm. Their world was of maintenance tents, heat shimmering off runway concrete, and long briefings filled with technical adjustments learned from the previous raid. Engineers modified cowlings, refined fuel mixtures, reinforced weak points, turning each mission into a lesson and each problem into an upgrade. The Superfortress was not a perfect machine, but it was supported by a system vast enough to absorb its imperfections and refine them into strength. Across the Pacific, Japanese airmen could sense this evolution, but could not see its machinery. They only felt the results. Bombers that flew higher, formations that tightened, attacks that grew more confident with every passing week. Yet none of this unfolded dramatically. It crept into daily life, into the notes scribbled in an operations log, into a pilot's quiet remark about fuel exhaustion, into the unease of gunners who watched the sky and felt distance in a new way. The change had no single moment of revelation. It accumulated in fragments, visible only to those who worked closest to the edges of Japan's defenses. And while these strains pressed upon the military, the cities below continued their routines, unaware that their long-trusted distance was beginning to lose its meaning.